Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the ownership of English. Ownership here may be to you an unusual term to apply to a language. It's obviously meant non-literally. We're talking about metaphorical ownership of a language. It may seem, as I said, to be an unusual term. I imagine when people first hear this, the idea that a language is owned, they would just think that, well, as Hook 2002 says, native speakers own their language, that ownership, if you think of ownership in the literal sense, to possess something, to control it, to make decisions about its use, and then these connotations of ownership are being used metaphorically to describe language. You could see how this would be reasonable to think that it's native speakers who make decisions about the language, either collectively in deciding how to use the language with new innovations and so on, or imposed ownership in the sense of dictionaries codifying language. That would probably seem reasonable, right? To think, oh, well, yeah, native speakers are the ones who do that, right? This guy here with the necktie, this is supposed to be a regular guy, right? This is the common man. I chose him because he was the one who looked most similar to me, except obviously the hair situation, right? So, or as Honey, John Honey, he has a book, The Story of Standard English and Its Enemies, which I think will give you some idea about his point of view. He says native speakers have to provide quality control over what happens to their language, right? So Honey thinks that without native speaker input, we will end up with the language will lose quality. He makes analogy to, for example, Latin, where Latin was a useful language spread across a large geographic area, but because there was none of that quality control, Latin fragmented into Spanish and Italian and French and Romanian and so on, and lost that beneficial use at the European and larger than Europe level, right? And he says the same could happen with English, right? That English has many benefits now in the sense that it allows us to communicate with people around the world who use the language as first or second or third and so on language speakers, and that without native speaker quality control, English could also fragment and end up in some future being multiple languages where we could no longer communicate with people in, for example, Australia or over in the United States or what have you. So quality control, right? And then for these people and people like them, they think that the ownership of English is especially important when compared to other languages because of what I just said, right? Because of the fact that English is such a big language, the biggest in terms of usage when we tally up first and second and additional language users, right? Chinese, Mandarin Chinese remains the biggest in terms of first language users, but English as the biggest language in terms of global use. And so that English is especially important. We often see things like this from Hook, this sort of triumphalist attitude about English, right? With English, doors in every field of endeavor stand wide open. Imagine what life is like for those knowing only Lithuanian, Czech, Pashto, or Turkish. I imagine if you are the speaker of one of those languages, you would take offense at this, the idea that your life is somehow limited in its scope because you don't speak English. But I think that's reasonably common for many people with this kind of attitude, right? That English is better. It certainly is more global, right? There's no doubt that more people use it. But the way it's phrased here seems to have that triumphalist attitude to me that, that it's a good thing that it was English and not some other language that became the dominant one globally. a more reasoned explanation of the importance of ownership. This is Lionel Wee here, who works in Singapore, as far as I recall. At least he did last time I checked. Wee here wrote, "The spread of English as a global language has led to the question of ownership. Who, it is often asked, really owns English? The answer to this question, it is suggested, has implications for a variety of issues, such as what standards of English are acceptable, how it should be taught, and how problems of intelligibility ought to be approached." That sounds reasonable to say that those things are, those questions that he asks, standards, intelligibility, teaching, those are questions that are, of course, very important for any language, for English, perhaps more so because of its global reach. Linguists differ from the, whatever I called him, the regular guy that we saw earlier. Not necessarily in any way am I saying they're more clever than regular people, but they've had more opportunity, taken more time to think about such things and to think about the implications of just saying that native speakers own their language. This here is Henry Widdowson, probably one of the two most influential British linguists. The other one I would say is probably Deborah Cameron. But anyway, here's Henry Widdowson. Or these living linguists. You'd have Halliday too, who's unfortunately died. Henry Widdowson was the one who largely came up with the metaphor of using ownership to talk about language. And he says that we have to consider extending the ownership, the idea of ownership, to others beyond just native speakers. He gives the fascinating example that you should all know of the word postpone and other words that share the etymology of postpone. We all know postpone means to make something later. To postpone a meeting means to move the start time later in time. Then Widdowson gives this other word, depone, where the pone part is from a similar root. But depone comes from legal English. It means to take a sworn statement, right? We don't hear the verb depone too much, but you've probably heard the noun form deposition. If you watch crime dramas, you'll see the police will talk about taking a deposition from the witness. In other words, getting her or his sworn statement as to what happened, right? To take a deposition. Now, if we tell most native English speakers this word depone, most of them don't know it. That's fine. Most of them don't really care that they don't know it. They don't feel unintelligent. They don't feel like that it's a sign of a lack of awareness. They just say things like, well, yeah, it's a specialized word from the law, depone, and therefore, yeah, it's a real word, but it's not one I use. Fine. Widdowson goes on then to discuss prepone, which he cites as having come from Indian English and largely being confined to Indian speakers of English. Prepone, as you can imagine, is an antonym of postpone. So to prepone something is to move the start time forward, to make it earlier. And so you can say things like, well, the meeting was at 2, but let's prepone it to 1. And that would be perfectly acceptable. And in fact, that's more, it's the economy of language principle applies there, right? To say that in standard British English, you'd have to say the meeting is at 2, let's move it forward to 1. So move it forward, 3 words becomes prepone. So it's simple to use. It's the meaning is obvious. The pone with post substituted for pre. It seems like a perfectly logical use of the word, and yet, as Widdowson points out with this word and with others like this, if we tell native English speakers this, native English speakers of varieties other than in Indian English, don't forget there are millions of Indians for whom English is a native language. I mean, Indians in India, right? If we tell people about prepone, they often shy away from accepting it as legitimate. They'll say, well, I can see where you'd get that word, postpone, prepone, but it doesn't sound like a real word if you tell me that Indians use it. It feels like it's for them and not for us. And so the reaction to new words like depone and prepone is based largely on the origin of the word. If people are told it comes from legal English, they seem to accept it, and if they're told that it comes from Indian English, they seem to reject the legitimacy of that word and think that it shouldn't be codified as in made into part of the code, right? Put in the dictionary. That depone is legitimately codified and that prepone shouldn't be legitimately codified. But Whittleston's argument is that, but what's the logic for that then? Why is the origin from native English-speaking lawyers acceptable, but then we illogically reject the same process of introducing new words into the language? We illogically reject it because it was non-native speakers, for the most part. Indian English speakers are non-native speakers. For the most part, they're non-native, and so we reject the word, right? So his argument, as you see here, is that English, we can't think of English as a possession which native English speakers lease out to others while retaining the freehold. This is British property terminology, that you're leasing out, you're renting it, you're letting them borrow it, while the native English speakers retain the freehold. The native English speakers really own it, and that they're lending it out. Whittleston says we can't think of that. We have to think of it as other people actually own it, right? You may not know these people, you may not be familiar with the context in which they live, but for them, the language, any language, of course, but here we're talking about English, the language is just as important to them, just as necessary to their lives, whether in different registers, different contexts. It's just as necessary to them as your use of the language is to you. And that it's only some sort of illogical prejudice that allows us to think that the word is useful, real or not. I mean, for most of us, prepone would probably be a more useful word going forward from now than depone would ever be, right? You're far more likely to want to prepone something than you are to depone a witness, unless you become a police officer or other legal professional. There is no doubt that native speakers of English are deferred to in our English language teaching profession. What they say is invested with both authenticity and authority. Whittleston says this, but don't think that he means that this is a good thing, right? He's standing up for people around the world who teach English or use English, of course, and saying that we have to consider that what they say should be seen as invested with authenticity and authority based on their situation, right? Their use of the language, their need for the language may be different from mine, yours, ours, but that they will also have authentic interactions that use English, and perhaps multilingual interactions, in particular as teachers. But you could think of this as applying to business people, to travelers, anyone, right? That their use of the language for them is authentic, and that sometimes over time new novel uses of the language arise, and that we have to accept them as part of the process of the development of a global language. Back to Lionel Wee, he argues that there are two arguments for this ownership being seen as legitimate regardless of native, non-native speaker status. The nativization argument, nativization, right? The language becomes native in new contexts. Much as I just said, new contexts lead to new usage that are appropriate for that place. I'm going to put my light on. I feel like it's getting dark here. It may not matter, but I'll do it. That spread leads to change, leads to variation, but that those variations become rule-bound, right? Become systematic. They may be different rules, then they are in your place, but that those rules, if they're systematic, they're not just errors, they're not just one-off occurrences, they're systematic new varieties, new variants, and the accumulation of variants makes the variety, right? So like with depone and prepone, that prepone becomes nativized in Indian English and thus becomes legitimate for them, and that we shouldn't therefore see it as a sort of deficient word for some funny English that those people over there speak, but we over here speak the real one. No, they speak of different variety. We don't. It's not saying that we have to use the word ourselves. We don't necessarily have to accept prepone as part of British or Canadian, in my case, English. We don't have to necessarily accept the word as part of our own variety, but we can't look at it as a deficient lexeme, in this case, of some other variety. And he gives the numerical argument and simply says that claims that speakers for whom English is the second language outnumber those for whom it is the first language. There's just, in many ways, there are just more of them. I say them in my case, meaning the non-native English speakers, but of course some of you will be non-native English speakers. There are more non-native English speakers than there are native English speakers. That should matter, right? That there are innumerable, well, they're numerable. You can look at sources such as Gradle or Crystal to get more accurate numbers, but a rough estimate is that a third of the world speak English with a reasonable amount of fluency, and that another third speak English to some extent that they can be communicative in certain domains, right? Perhaps, they couldn't talk in English about various topics, but they can with regards to their work, for example, right? So a lot of the world speak English. That must matter, right? The nativization argument, English is different in different places and is legitimate in that place, even though it's different from yours. The numerical argument, we have to just think about the fact that so many non-native English speakers speak English. We can't just be dismissive of that and say, but that doesn't matter in terms of the legitimacy of their English. You will know here you may not know his picture, Braj Kachru, but I imagine you're familiar with his discussion of the three circles of English. If you are familiar with this, you may want to fast forward until you see this slide is done, but otherwise stay here for a bit, right? Kachru came up with this useful model to separate use of English according to country, according to one of three circles. The inner circle is, as you see there, USA, UK, and so on, countries where English is the dominant language in all spheres, right? Where it's the language used by most people for most purposes. There may be many speakers of other languages, right? The Maori speakers of New Zealand, the French speakers of Canada, the Spanish speakers of the United States, and so on. There may be speakers of other languages, but for the most part, we're talking about English as the dominant language. Not necessarily the official language. Some countries have official languages, some don't. That doesn't matter, just dominant in all spheres. In the outer circle, you see countries where English often has important roles in some spheres. Many of these countries that you see here, Ghana, Liberia, and so on, English, for example, in these countries, what may happen is that, for example, primary and secondary school, you will learn, your schooling will largely be in your home language, whatever language that is, right? And then when you move to tertiary education and go to university, and you meet students from around the country who speak different first languages, then English becomes the language of education at tertiary level. Or English may be officially a language of the country along with other languages, or English may be used in the legal system. So in outer circle countries, we're talking about a situation where English is sometimes used and other languages are sometimes used, and those other languages would mostly be for the purposes of home and familial interactions with acquaintances and so on, and that English will be used for official purposes when necessary. And then the expanding circle is pretty much the rest of the world, places where English is largely confined to education, but as an additional subject, not like in, say, outer circle countries where you often have your education in English. You learn math, or you learn economics, or you learn biology in English, right? In the expanding circle, we're talking about places where you learn English in, for example, where you learn math and biology in Japanese or Korean, and you take English as an additional subject. And English is largely in those countries used for international purposes, right? That Koreans would be using English to speak to non-Koreans, whereas in the outer circle, sometimes the people in the countries here will be using English to interact with people from their own country. That's the big difference, right? Or one of the differences. People have criticized Catru's have criticized his model over time in various ways. They've talked about some problems with it, perhaps, how do we fit Israel in accurately, and so on. Yeah, sure, it's not 100% flawless, we can quibble, but it still remains a very useful tool for a starting point of discussions of English, right? If you're thinking about how English works in any particular place, a good first step is to localize it within one of these circles. Catru, the journal that he was influential in starting was called the World English's Journal. What he did was, and others like him, was to really push the idea of studying English and legitimizing English in the outer circle, right? That we shouldn't just think of Nigerian English, Indian English, Singaporean English as deficient models of American or British or Australian or what have you English, right? That we shouldn't just think, well, they're trying to speak, that the Indians really wish they could speak British English, but they're not doing a very good job of it. His argument was, no, Indian English is worthy of study and legitimacy as a subject on its own, right? And so that's what the World English's Journal does, or rather did. I mean, it's expanded now into the expanding circle, but largely it was focused on the outer circle at first, right? So that's Catru's influence was really felt there in legitimizing the study and value of English in the outer circle. He called them institutionalized varieties of English, right? Where the variety of English is often, as it says, used in institutions, used in education, in government, in law. This is relatively uncontroversial, as I write here, amongst linguists. Linguists, for the most part, not all of them, you saw honey and hook back on one of the earlier slides, but for the most part, this is not controversial. People think, yes, these are worthy areas of study. These are legitimate varieties of English. This avoids, I don't know if avoids is the right word. It doesn't mention, Catru's model doesn't mention the fact that, as I wrote here, it groups all the people into a country into one category. All of the Nigerians are considered outer circle language users, but of course we know that's not true, right? Some Nigerians will speak English fluently and only English. Some will speak English and other languages with some fluency. Perhaps some are balanced bilinguals. Perhaps some speak no English and only other languages, right? So of course the model doesn't allow us to predict. It allows us to make predictions about individuals within the country, but we cannot, of course, say anything about one individual with accuracy. We can't say, you are Nigerian, you speak this language, you are Singaporean, you speak that language. Of course not. So it's sometimes not entirely, I shouldn't say sometimes, it's not entirely precise for talking about individuals, but it's certainly useful for talking about groups of people. What I just did there was describe the decline of bilingualism, right? You may be, if you're a Singaporean, you may speak Mandarin Chinese and only Mandarin Chinese. You may speak English and only English, or you may be somewhere on the decline, right? With balanced bilingual in the middle, more Chinese or more English, depending on your individual case, right? And that's for Chinese Singaporeans. Of course, other Singaporeans speak Malay and Tamil. Sorry, it's escaped my mind at the moment. More recently, people like Jenkins listed here have said that we should even consider expanding the idea of ownership to the expanding circle, right? That the people from Brazil and China and Japan and the other countries that are listed in Katru's expanding circle, for them, English matters when they use it. It may matter just as much to them as it does to people in the outer circle, right? That they may have characteristic features of their type of English that show us that it's nativized. There may be great numbers of them, right? Millions and millions of Chinese people are studying English, of course, right, in China or abroad. So that this ownership should therefore be expanded out to the expanding circle. I keep saying expanded. I should try to be more spectacular with my language use. This ownership is being pushed out to the expanding circle. This ownership is being extended to the expanding circle, something like that, right? How do we then, if we can't just say that you own English if you're in the inner circle and the others don't, or you own English then, according to the early arguments from Katru, you own English if you're in the inner and outer circles, or then Jenkins and others saying you own English if you're in the inner, outer, and expanding circle. What can we do then? People have tried to reframe the discussion in various ways. Some of them are not particularly convincing, right? Higgins defines ownership as legitimacy as a speaker that is expressed through English speakers' footing, the alignment we take up to ourselves and the others present as expressed in the way we manage the production or reception of an utterance. That you are a legitimate English user and an owner of English through your own footing, your stance as to how you use English and how you receive others' English. That if you speak in a way that makes it clear that you seem to feel like English is yours, then we have to see you as legitimate. But I think this doesn't account for the fact that others looking in may still not give you that legitimacy. People may hear you speak and hear you speak fluently and still think, well, yeah, but you're not a real owner of English because of your accent, probably would be the primary thing, or because of your word choice, right? Your lexical choice and so on. I think we see this in research like that done by Matsuda here, where she says, right, so what did she went to, as you see, a bunch is not the academic term, of course. She talked to groups of Japanese students and asked them about English. What do they think of English? How do they use English? Who owns English? And as you see here, she wrote that although they perceive English as an international language in a sense that it is being used internationally, they do not believe it belongs internationally. What they feel contradicts what the linguists feel, right? That it's not possible for these students to see English as being a Japanese thing. That they, as it says here, again from Matsuda 2003, the scholarly view of English as owned by everyone does not seem to be held by ELF users. I know there's a lot of acronyms here. EIL is English as an international language. ELF is English as a lingua franca. Various terms have been used over time in various ways to talk about these things. The precise nomenclature is not important. Just to think of this as various terms for discussing how English can be described as a global phenomenon. I had to pause there for a second. Apologies. And I'll have to skip through to where I was. Sorry about that. But what do we have thus far, right? A conflict between linguists who say liberal linguists who extend the idea of ownership internationally, and people like these Japanese students, and who are, I'm using them as a discourse metaphor for people around the world who often don't feel like English is legitimately theirs because they're not native speakers, right? They don't feel like nativization matters. As for numerical arguments, we see numerous quotations like this from Kogo and Dewey saying the majority use of the language has shifted away from L1 settings, right? That most people, they're saying here, in other words, that most interactions are not happening, most English interactions are not happening between native speakers. They're happening between, a Korean doing business with a Portuguese person or a Japanese traveler speaking English in Pakistan and so on, right? That its majority use involves non-native settings. And we see other arguments like that, right? Gradle saying that non-native speakers outnumber native speakers. Most interactions, the second bold quote from Gradle here is really just echoing Kogo and Dewey, right? Most interactions take place without a native speaker being around, that they're in fact between non-native speakers, and so on. You can pause here if you want to read these. I won't go through them individually. And even more. Now, a lot of this, I think, people like Seidelhofer, Kogo, and Dewey, they were wanting to legitimize English through numbers by saying that it must matter because there's a lot of people. Jenkins here, my own PhD supervisor, they wanted to show that there were a lot of people, and so it mattered to take account of their English. Does that really matter or not? I'll leave it for you to consider that, yes, there are a lot of people, and so yes, that must somehow legitimize their English use as non-native speakers. But how would you apply that then to other languages? Would you say that, languages with small numbers of users are, say, a much smaller language, say Italian and as spoken by native Italian speakers, and Italian as spoken by others, would you have the same sense of legitimacy when the numbers we were talking about were much smaller? And Italian's still a pretty big language. Think of a very small language. Would you define legitimacy in terms of the numbers or not, right? I think that perhaps for me at least, I'm more convinced by the nativization argument, the idea that it doesn't matter how many people, what matters is the systematic use of their variety and the fact that it's important to them in various domains, in the same way that English is important to monolingual English speakers in all domains. In Singapore, to give an example, we see here English is an official language along with Malay, Tamil, and Chinese. I was right earlier when I said Tamil. English is considered the working language of the country, the language that people from various backgrounds, various ethnic backgrounds with various home languages use. Some people are native speakers, some are non-native speakers, as you see here. I shouldn't jump ahead. What does that tell us, right? I mean, it's complex in the sense of only 20% are native. Pretty much everyone else, especially when they're younger, speak English with some amount of fluency. I put this here to think, but which of the two seems to matter to you more? The fact that there are a lot of them, or the fact that they use it as the working language, the fact that it's an official language, the fact that if you go to Singapore, you can speak English with people, most people from various backgrounds, but it will certainly sound different. You may have some trouble understanding things at first, although it doesn't take long to get used to a new variety. Which of those matters to you more, the nativization or the numbers? As I said earlier, for me, it's the nativization that convinces me more that Singaporean English is not a deficient model of British English, that it's a legitimate variety of English in its own right and worthy of study and so on, right? That's what I was saying over the last couple of minutes. You can read some details here about numbers. I think the argument from Crystal here is more nuanced in terms of numbers for thinking about the future. As he says, you can pause to read these if you want, but as he says in the second quotation, it may matter for all of us because over time, some things like, for example, informations, right? For native English speakers, information is a non-count noun. We say I have some information. We don't say I have 3 information. We say I have 3 pieces of information, of course. Over time, because of the great number of non-native English speakers who do consider information to be a count noun, because for most languages, at least those I'm aware of and those I've asked about, for most languages, information is countable. You can say, I have 3 information for you. Because of the great number of use, that will probably affect native English over time and change native English to account for the dominant use of information as a count noun. Or similarly for pronunciation, as he says, the difference between thin and this, right? You have th and the. That's a sign of native English speakerness, the fact that you can differentiate between thin and this, the th and the. But in terms of, as Jenkins wrote, she has a book called the Phonological Core of English as an International Language, as she wrote, but that pronunciation doesn't matter, right? It doesn't, in context, you would know if someone says this or this, give me this, do you want this one, do you want this one? In context, that doesn't actually matter. Most people would understand what you meant, whether you say 3 or 3. You know, I've got 3 apples, 3 apples. Doesn't actually matter. So the ability to distinguish between the two that native speakers take pride in, let's say, is really only a social marker of native speakerness and doesn't mark anything communicatively because we understand 3 apples or 3 apples. It's kind of hard to say it, 3 apples, right? That it's a social marker, not communicatively important. And so the numbers may matter in that sense. Not so much now. We can see that now nativization should legitimize non-native varieties, but that numbers may matter to all of us in the future because non-native varieties will dominate native varieties and probably change them, or will do as Honey said and fragment as Latin did and end up not understanding each other at all sometime in the future. So questions for discussion, right? Who owns English? Are you convinced by Catrew? Are you convinced by Jenkins? Catrew that it's extended to the outer circle, Jenkins that it's considered expanded to the expanding circle? Or are you convinced by Honey and Hook, who say no, English is owned within the inner circle and leave it there? Rajagopalan proposes, well, we shouldn't really think of anyone as owning it because he's saying ownership implies too much control, and really with a living language we don't have enough control. There's no top-down force that imposes the rules. Sometimes people think, well, the dictionaries, the grammar books, don't they impose the rules? But the dictionaries really only codify the rules after they are created bottom up from speakers of the language, right? That, you know, British speakers all start saying "in it" as an invariant tag question instead of mucking around with saying "isn't it," "isn't she," "aren't you," "weren't they." They just, you can say "in it" in all of those cases. That comes bottom up from speaker use, and then the dictionary will codify it later. But because no one is in charge overall of the initial creation of new morphology, new lexis, new phonology, that English is not owned by anyone. That it's just shaped at local levels, which sometimes become global levels through pop culture, through, you know, films and books and so on, right? Who owns English? Other answers, maybe, right? Here's a list of references. I think they're all there. And so I'll leave you with that, right? Think about your own answer to Who Owns English, and how would you, of course, support the claim that you feel is the most accurate. Thank you very much. Bye.